Early October 2025 satellite images revealed a stunning sight, an ocean of stranded trucks stretching across Kazakhstan's western steppe. More than 7,500 vehicles sat motionless under the open sky, their drivers trapped between two borders. How did a customs checkpoint become the choke point of Russia's war machine? Could this seemingly bureaucratic traffic jam signal the beginning of a deeper collapse within Putin's sanctioned economy? Kazakhstan's abrupt decision to halt technology-laden cargo from China to Russia shocked Moscow and global markets alike. Officially, Astana cited compliance with international sanctions. Yet analysts from Reuters and DW note that the move also reflected years of pent-up frustration toward Moscow's heavy-handed dominance in Central Asia. This was not a confrontation of arms, but of leverage. By weaponizing trade routes, Kazakhstan turned Russia's own sanctions paranoia into a strategic trap. Customs inspections that once took hours now dragged on for weeks. Russian officers, under strict new Kremlin directives, began examining every shipment suspected of carrying dual-use components, microchips, optics, batteries, or drone electronics. What started as Moscow's attempt to tighten control over imports soon backfired spectacularly. The border slowed to a crawl, and Kazakhstan responded with symmetrical measures effectively sealing the gate. According to The Guardian, over 40% of Russia's parallel imports from China traditionally crossed through Kazakh territory. These shipments kept factories alive from automotive plants in Tatarstan to defense complexes in the Urals. The sudden freeze triggered a logistical nightmare. Perishable goods spoiled, truckers faced fuel shortages, and insurance claims skyrocketed. From the domino effect analysis perspective, this single administrative decision in Astana began toppling Russia's delicate wartime supply chain like a row of dominoes. When semiconductors stop at the border, tank factories stall. When factories stall, brigades at the front run out of armored reinforcements. And when reinforcements fail to arrive, entire defensive sectors collapse. Economists estimate that for every day of delay at the Kazakh crossing, Russia loses roughly $90 million in manufacturing value. The BBC reported that small industrial towns dependent on imported components already faced temporary shutdowns, cutting wages and creating unrest among factory workers. Meanwhile, Beijing, whose exporters were losing billions in delayed shipments, publicly urged stability and predictability in cross-border logistics. The opportunity cost perspective reveals an even heavier burden. To clear the backlog, Moscow must redeploy limited resources, more customs officers, additional storage, and emergency fuel subsidies for idling trucks. Each ruble spent on bureaucracy is a ruble diverted from the front line. In effect, the Kremlin is paying twice, first for the war, then for the chaos its own paranoia created. Strategically, this blockade exposed a contradiction at the heart of Putin's eastward policy. Russia had sought salvation through China and the post-Soviet land bridge of Kazakhstan. Yet the very partners meant to shield it from Western sanctions were now enforcing those same rules. As Defense News observed, Astana's move shows that Moscow's regional influence can crumble not with tanks, but with paperwork. The images of endless trucks have become an emblem of Russia's self-inflicted isolation. Steel ghosts stranded on the steppe engines, silent, carrying the broken pulse of a sanctioned empire. Western officials quietly praise the development as a turning point, a non-military blockade born from diplomacy and economic pressure rather than missiles. For Putin, this isn't just an inconvenience, it's a test of survival. The line of trucks is more than a border jam. It's a mirror reflecting the limits of Moscow's control over its neighbors and its own war economy. Meanwhile, the Kremlin insists the situation is temporary, but reports from Al Jazeera suggest otherwise. Customs queues continue to expand, drivers remain unpaid, and spare parts for critical defense production are running out. Yet what happens when those missing parts begin to paralyze factories deep inside Russia? By mid-October 2025, Moscow's silence on the Kazakh border crisis had turned from caution to desperation. The Kremlin's official line called it a temporary technical issue, but within Russia's industrial heartland, silence had become the sound of shutdowns. How could a single choke point in Kazakhstan unravel an entire wartime economy? What hidden chain reactions inside Russia's factories would soon begin to surface? To understand the scale, one must revisit the lifeline that kept Russia's economy breathing under sanctions parallel imports. After the invasion of Ukraine, Western embargoes blocked nearly every critical technology Moscow relied upon: chips, optics, engines, and advanced software. In response, Russia quietly built a vast gray network across Central Asia. Kazakhstan became its central artery, the discrete corridor that funneled Chinese-made technology into Russian factories under civilian cover. For 2 years, this network worked with near-surgical precision. Chinese trucks loaded with dual-use goods, electronic circuits, sensors, drone components passed through Kazakh customs and entered Russia disguised as commercial shipments. The system fueled everything from tank assembly lines in Nizhny Tagil to drone workshops in Kaluga. But when Kazakhstan invoked compliance with Western sanctions in early October 2025, that artery clotted overnight. BBC Business reported that over 70% of Russia's microchip imports through Central Asia stopped within a single week. In the domino effect analysis view, the blockade struck at the weakest link of Russia's industrial machine, its dependence on foreign technology. One stuck convoy in Kazakhstan translated to halted assembly lines hundreds of kilometers away. Factories that once produced T-90M tanks and Orlan 10 drones suddenly lacked key microcontrollers and guidance modules. You can have steel, but without semiconductors, your tanks are blind, noted retired U.S. Colonel Mark Kanshin in an interview with Defense News. He called the crisis a blood clot in the veins of the Russian war economy. Opportunity cost. Analysis paints an even harsher picture. To replace the lost flow, Russia must divert vast resources, military cargo planes rerouted for supply transport, emergency rail logistics, and costly attempts to source components via Mongolia or the Caucasus. Each workaround consumes manpower and fuel needed for the front. Every hour spent rerouting a truck is an hour not spent moving ammunition or medical supplies to Ukraine's front lines. The numbers tell their own story. According to Reuters, Russia's industrial output dropped nearly 4% in September 2025, the steepest decline since early 2023. Civilian industries felt it. First, car plants paused production, telecommunications firms postponed upgrades, and medical device factories suspended operations. The result, a cascading loss of trust within domestic markets and shrinking foreign investment. Under the strategic contrast perspective, Putin's long-promised pivot to Asia now appears hollow. His aim was self-sufficiency and independence from the West. Yet the reliance on parallel imports through Kazakhstan and China exposes a paradox: Russia's sovereignty now depends entirely on others' willingness to bend the rules. It's the illusion of independence, wrote the New York Times, built on someone else's compliance. Western analysts highlight how this logistical choke has reshaped NATO's calculus. Instead of costly airlifts or direct military aid, the West achieved a strategic victory by influencing trade corridors. The Kazakh blockade, though non-violent, inflicted the same disruption as a precision strike on a supply depot. Meanwhile, inside Russia, public frustration grows. Truckers stranded for weeks post videos showing rotting food and confiscated cargo. Local governors plead for intervention, but Moscow's bureaucracy remains paralyzed. Each day of delay magnifies the sense of decay. Factories' idle wages freeze, morale drops. Still, Putin clings to the rhetoric of resilience, vowing to expand Eurasian partnerships. Yet Beijing's patience is thinning, and Astana is unmoved by threats. The once solid image of a united anti-Western bloc now looks fractured and self-defeating. If Russia's economic pulse is slowing at the border, what happens when the arteries feeding its defense sector finally collapse altogether? Meanwhile, far from the border, a single missing shipment will soon reveal just how fragile that entire system truly is. By late October 2025, a single shipment from Shenzhen had become a symbol of Russia's deepening paralysis. Inside an unmarked truck sat a small crate containing field-programmable gate arrays, FPGA microchips, worth less than $20,000. Yet those few grams of silicon would determine whether Moscow's new generation of tanks could even see the battlefield. How could such a tiny component hold hostage the ambitions of an entire superpower? The journey began normally. Chinese suppliers disguised the chips under medical equipment invoices to avoid sanctions filters. For months, this sleight of hand kept Russian production lines alive. But when the truck reached the Kazakh-Russian border in early October, it joined the endless convoy halted by inspections. Russian customs, under new dual-use scrutiny orders, pulled the shipment for X-ray scans. Officers spotted the dense circuitry, seized the cargo, and filed for an extended verification. That bureaucratic pause turned into a production crisis. At Uralvagonzavod, the country's largest tank plant managers waited for that shipment to complete 40 unfinished T-90M hulls. Every day of delay costs us 3 tanks, an engineer told DW under anonymity. The plant's assembly line went silent, workers reassigned to maintenance, and local vendors laid off staff. According to Reuters, similar stoppages hit optical sensor factories in Ryazan and drone assembly sites near St. Petersburg. The domino effect analysis becomes painfully clear. One microchip seized in a warehouse creates ripples through multiple supply chains, eventually freezing an entire armored division. Meanwhile, Moscow faces impossible math. Under the opportunity cost perspective, replacing the seized cargo would require flying components via Mongolia, or the Arctic corridor routes 5 times costlier and weeks longer. Every ruble spent to reroute chips is 1 less ruble funding artillery shells or field rations. Western economists estimate Russia now spends up to 15% of its monthly defense budget just mitigating logistical bottlenecks. The strategic contrast is even sharper. Putin's doctrine promises technological sovereignty and a modernized army, yet his tanks depend on contraband microelectronics smuggled through neighboring states. Russia built a 21st century military on 20th century logistics, observes military analyst Michael Kaufman in The Economist. That contradiction exposes the limits of Moscow's long-vaunted resilience narrative. In Washington, President Donald Trump's administration views the border chaos as validation of its pressure campaign. U.S. officials quietly encourage Central Asian partners to maintain strict compliance, promising trade incentives for Kazakhstan and Mongolia. NATO planners note that logistics denial, not kinetic warfare, is increasingly shaping the battlefield. As Defense News reports, Ukraine's forces are already exploiting delayed Russian armor deliveries to regain ground in Donetsk. From a geopolitical angle, China is uneasy. Each stranded truck represents a Chinese exporter losing revenue and credibility under Western scrutiny. Beijing, juggling its Belt and Road commitments and fear of secondary sanctions, has begun quiet diplomacy, urging Moscow to ease its customs regime. Yet according to Al Jazeera, Russian security agencies refuse to relent, fearing infiltration and sabotage. The result is a cold war of paperwork between allies. Inside Russia, the social cost grows. Idle factory towns like Nizhny Tagil face reduced hours. Regional governors divert emergency funds to prevent unrest. State television blames foreign interference. But locals see empty payslips and silent assembly lines. The once steady rhythm of industry has turned into a stuttering heartbeat. This single microchip saga encapsulates the new face of modern warfare, where borders, sanctions, and bureaucracy can devastate armies more efficiently than bombs. Yet just as the factories pause, a new blow emerges not from abroad, but from within Russia itself. Meanwhile, an unexpected act of sabotage on the Trans-Siberian Railway will soon transform this logistical paralysis into a national emergency. In the final week of October 2025, Russia's logistics nightmare took a darker turn. A freight train carrying military supplies exploded on the Trans-Siberian Railway, the single route connecting Russia's eastern factories to its western front. Authorities initially blamed technical malfunction. Hours later, the FSB issued a chilling statement the saboteur was not Ukrainian but Russian. Could Moscow's economic collapse now be breeding its own internal rebellion? The explosion occurred near Chita, deep in eastern Siberia. The blast derailed a dozen fuel wagons, igniting a fire visible for kilometers. Investigators soon discovered traces of homemade explosives under the rails. Reuters confirmed that the attacker, a 53-year-old woman, confessed to collaborating with Ukrainian intelligence. Her motive to stop the killing. While the scale of damage seemed limited, the symbolic effect was enormous. From the domino effect perspective, this single act fractured an already strained system. With the Kazakhstan border sealed and the Trans-Siberian line damaged, Russia's industrial supply network suffered a complete seizure. Trains carrying tank engines, ammunition, and food were rerouted through the Baikal-Amur line, already operating at 140% capacity. Bottlenecks multiplied, fuel ran short, and freight insurance rates tripled within days. Opportunity cost analysis exposes the next blow. Every ton of military freight delayed forced Moscow to prioritize repairs over reinforcements. Rail engineers, spare parts, and funds once destined for frontline logistics were redirected to rebuild the destroyed segment. The Kremlin's Ministry of Transport reported temporary disruptions, yet leaked data cited by DW suggested at least a 2-week paralysis in the eastern corridor. For a military consuming thousands of shells daily, such a pause meant fewer supplies reaching Donetsk and Kharkiv. Strategic contrast perspective reveals the deepest irony. Putin had framed the Trans-Siberian line as proof of Russia's strategic depth, a lifeline immune to Western pressure. Yet now it stood as evidence of vulnerability. One citizen's bomb could paralyze the empire's main artery. The line meant to unite Russia has become the line that exposes its fractures, wrote The Guardian. Western analysts quickly recognized the implications. NATO logistics experts told Defense News that the sabotage amplifies the cumulative pressure created by Kazakhstan's blockade. Instead of direct military confrontation, the West's multi-layered approach, economic strangulation, diplomatic pressure, and domestic destabilization, was now converging. The Anaconda strategy, as Al Jazeera called it, was tightening around Russia from both outside and within. Inside Russia, panic spread through the transport sector. The Ministry of Industry ordered military factories to suspend outbound shipments until routes were secured. Civilian goods piled up in depots and energy exports through Siberia slowed. It's like a cardiac arrest for Russian logistics, noted Polish analyst Wojciech Lorenz of the PISM think tank. On social media, truckers and railway workers voiced frustration over collapsing wages and endless inspections. Moscow's censorship office deleted hundreds of posts, but whispers persisted. The system was failing from exhaustion, not sabotage. For the Kremlin, the crisis struck at a fragile psychological threshold. Each interruption, first Kazakhstan's customs choke, then internal sabotage, proved that control was slipping from the center. Economists from Bloomberg estimated combined logistical losses exceeding $4 billion by month's end. Inflation rose as imported goods dwindled. Still, Putin's government doubled down, framing the attack as terrorism orchestrated by NATO. Yet Western intelligence sources dismissed this as propaganda, noting that internal dissent, not foreign infiltration, was eroding Russia's stability. The sabotage, though minor in blast radius, detonated politically across Moscow. It demonstrated that resistance no longer needed drones or missiles, just one disillusioned citizen. Meanwhile, as trains stalled and factories froze, Western diplomats quietly pushed for new secondary sanctions, targeting Russia's overland routes through Mongolia. What followed next would turn this economic siege into a full-scale diplomatic stranglehold, one that left even Russia's allies scrambling for distance. By early November 2025, Moscow's crisis had outgrown the borders of Eurasia. What began as a logistical jam in Kazakhstan and a sabotage act in Siberia was now reshaping global trade politics. Western capitals called it a non-military containment, but in Moscow, officials called it something darker: economic asphyxiation. Could diplomacy and sanctions without a single missile fired really cripple a superpower more effectively than war itself? The pattern was clear. Kazakhstan's customs freeze and the Trans-Siberian blast had exposed the fragility of Russia's wartime logistics. The West quickly moved to exploit it. Washington and Brussels launched coordinated diplomatic pressure across Central Asia, warning that any nation assisting Russia's parallel import system risked secondary sanctions. According to Reuters, this warning reached Astana, Bishkek, and even Tashkent through quiet back channels. The message was simple: choose trade with the global market or trade with a besieged Russia. Kazakhstan chose survival. Its leadership announced that compliance with international regulations was non-negotiable. A statement analysts in DW interpreted as indirect confirmation of Western coordination. From the domino effect lens, each regional government, now closing its border, added another tile to the chain reaction, accelerating Russia's isolation. What began with trucks at one checkpoint evolved into a continental blockade stretching from the Caspian to the Pacific. Opportunity-cost analysis underscores the quiet pain within the Kremlin. To offset the sanctions pressure, Moscow was forced to redirect investment from infrastructure to crisis management. Railway maintenance budgets were raided to subsidize importers. Oil export earnings were spent on emergency logistics instead of domestic welfare. Every dollar used to patch a broken bridge meant one less dollar funding hospitals or pensions. As The Economist noted, Russia is no longer fighting a war of choice, it's fighting a war of logistics. In the strategic contrast view, the contradiction was striking. Putin's doctrine of self-reliance had produced deeper dependence. His pivot to Asia left Russia trapped between cautious China and defiant Kazakhstan. The same trade routes meant to bypass the West now operated under Western rules. A BBC analysis summarized it bluntly: Russia's eastward escape has become its eastern cage. The United States, under President Donald Trump, capitalized swiftly. Senior administration officials praised Kazakhstan's firm adherence to fair trade standards, while offering new energy investment packages through the International Development Finance Corporation. NATO economists quietly monitored the impact, noting that Russia's defense output could drop another 6% by year's end. This is sanctions warfare by endurance, a Pentagon logistics advisor told Defense News. Starve the arteries, and the heart stops itself. Inside Russia, the social toll deepened. Inflation neared 18%, spare part shortages, grounded airlines, and urban supermarkets rationed imported goods. The Kremlin launched an information campaign calling for patriotic patience. Yet public confidence eroded as workers faced unpaid wages and frozen transport hubs. Western experts like Maria Snegovaya of Georgetown observed, The moment ordinary Russians realize their suffering stems from Moscow's policies, not Western pressure, the legitimacy crisis begins. From Almaty to Brussels, diplomats sensed a shift. The war was no longer defined by drones or front lines, but by the invisible siege on Russia's logistics. The anaconda had tightened another coil. Still, questions linger. Would China rescue its embattled partner, or watch quietly as Russia's leverage faded? Meanwhile, Beijing's patience was wearing thin, and its next move would determine whether Moscow's land bridge could ever reopen or remain a relic of a failed empire. By mid-November 2025, the silence from Beijing had become deafening. Chinese officials avoided direct criticism of Moscow. Yet trade data told the story. Cross-border shipments to Russia had fallen by nearly 35% in a single month. For a partnership once proclaimed without limits, the downturn spoke louder than any press release. Was China quietly letting Russia's logistical lifeline die to protect itself from Western sanctions? According to Reuters and the South China Morning Post, Beijing's Ministry of Commerce issued confidential guidance urging exporters to exercise caution when dealing with Russia-bound goods that might attract U.S. scrutiny. That phrase, analysts noted, effectively froze half of China's dual-use trade. Behind closed doors, Chinese technology firms were already rerouting shipments through neutral Southeast Asian ports to avoid secondary sanctions. China's priority is preserving access to Western markets, not rescuing Moscow, explained BBC correspondent Laura Bicker. From the domino effect viewpoint, China's hesitance triggered cascading fallout. Each Chinese exporter that paused deliveries forced Kazakh freight companies to idle fleets. Those idle fleets left Russian factories without inputs, and those factories halted pay for thousands of workers. Within weeks, the chain reaction reached the battlefield itself. Ukrainian forces, benefiting from renewed Western resupply, exploited Russia's dwindling fuel convoys along the Donetsk front. Opportunity cost analysis reveals the growing trade-off haunting the Kremlin. To revive the Kazakh route, Moscow would need to grant Beijing unprecedented economic concessions, discounted energy contracts, mining rights in Siberia, even partial ownership of logistics hubs once considered sovereign. Each concession buys time but erodes independence. Putin can either keep his pride or keep his supply lines, said defense economist Marcus Stanley on DW. He can't have both. The strategic contrast could not be starker. Russia entered this decade vowing to lead a multipolar Eurasia free from Western dominance. Now it stands dependent on the very countries it once sought to command. Kazakhstan enforces sanctions, China hesitates, and Mongolia negotiates from a position of strength. The image of a resurgent empire has withered into one of isolation. In Washington, President Donald Trump's administration interprets Beijing's restraint as a victory of deterrence. The U.S. Treasury's threat of massive secondary sanctions succeeded where diplomacy once faltered. European energy markets, once anxious about Russian retaliation, stabilized as the flow of refined products from Russia plummeted. NATO planners described the outcome as a sanctions breakthrough achieved through the back door of Eurasia. Still, the deeper implications stretch beyond economics. For decades, Russia envisioned the Belt and Road Corridor as its gateway to relevance in Asia. Now that corridor lies dormant under a pile of stranded trucks. Western observers call it the end of Russia's continental illusion. Chinese think tanks, too, have grown wary. Global Times editorials now stress mutual respect for national interests, a subtle warning that Moscow's instability has become a liability. At home, frustration simmers. Russian truckers trapped on the steppe upload videos of snow-covered convoys, while factory foremen complain that patriotism doesn't power machines. Local protests, rare but spreading, underscore how economic suffocation, not ideology, erodes control. Each day of paralysis chips away at the narrative of strength that once defined Putin's regime. The final irony: the same strategy Moscow used for years leveraging dependency has now been turned against it. Kazakhstan's sanctions, compliance, China's caution, and the West's patience together formed an economic siege so subtle it required no gunfire. Meanwhile, as winter grips the steppe and the queues of trucks fade into snow, the question lingers: can a nation fight two wars at once? One on the battlefield, and one against the slow strangulation of its own supply lines.